Hello and welcome to Python Fundamentals. In this course, we learn the underpinning Python programming skills, preparing for our journey towards mastering the Django Framework and the Python programming language. This tutorial is part of a series of tutorials. You can find the link to the whole playlist in the video description. This tutorial is from our Python Programming Fundamentals for Django Developers course, which you can find and purchase on Udemy. You will find all the latest and updated tutorials, as well as resources and assessments to help accelerate your learning of the subject. The link to the course, which will always provide the best price, can be found in the video description. One of the basic principles that we try to follow as a developer is to try and build applications whereby we don't repeat the same piece of code more than once. There is an acronym commonly used, DRY, don't repeat yourself, and this just emphasizes my point. Now, very often when working with, for example, list data structures that hold multiple values, we need to repeat the same process for each of the values that's stored in the data structure, for example, a list. This is where we have to ask ourselves, well, how can we repeat the same process for each item or each element or for each object, for example, in a list? This is where the idea or concept of loops is introduced. Loops will provide the tools to enable us to repeat the same process over a range of different values, for example, values stored in a list. With a loop, we can generate statements which can be executed for each item in a list, for example, without having to repeat any code. Also known as control flow statements, we can develop these loops utilizing Python's for loops or while loops. In this section, of course, we focus in on for loops. If you remember back to the type section of this course, we discussed the idea that there were many different data types. Those data types can be categorized. We generated a category called sequence. And for example, there are a number of different data types classed as a sequence. For example, a string, a list, a tuple, a dictionary. These data types are considered data types in which we can iterate over. So these data types all store multiple values. Those values can be iterated over, which means that we can individually look at every single value that these data structures are storing. We will learn how to iterate or loop through these data structures. Take this example here where we have a list. In this list, we have 5 elements here. So let's imagine we wanted to, for example, print out each of these different elements in this list. What we would have to do is that we would have to iterate or loop over this data structure. Every time we loop over this data structure, then we want to extract the data from the list, individual item, and then we want to maybe perform some sort of action on it. And then once we've finished, we then go back to the list and we want to grab the next item or element in the list, perform the same function. So we're going to what is described as iterate over this list. So like I said, when we iterate or loop through this list, we get the first element, we do something, and then we get the second element in the list, and then we do something again. And this do something is the same. This is where we're trying to avoid having to repeat any code. By performing a loop of this piece of code here, we only need to build one piece of code, which is going to perform the same action on all the elements in this list. To build a for loop in Python is very simple. Here we have an example of a list, and we want to iterate or loop through this list. So here we have the keyword in Python for. Here we have this val, which represents a variable that can be utilized within this for loop. And here at the end, we have X, which is the list, the iterable. That could be a list, could be a dictionary, could be a string. Remember, we can iterate over any data type that is considered an iterable. To help us easily understand this, let's get rid of the variable and let's just use the data structure here, for example. So to give you a general overview of what's happening here, we're going to loop through this data. Every time we loop through this list here, we're going to print out the value. So what's happening here in general terms is the code is executed. The first time this code is executed, this loop, we're going to grab the first element in this list. This is going to be passed over to this variable val, and this can then be utilized within the body of this for loop. And notice then we print off val. So once we're finished with that, we check to see if we've come to the end of a list. If we have come to the end of a list, we'll stop executing this loop and just move on to the next line in our code. Now, if there is a next item in the list, then we move across to the next item, then B then is placed into this variable val here, and then we can go ahead and execute the body of this for loop, which is to print out the value. Of course, this is just a simple example. There may be many different statements inside of this for loop body. But let's just take a look at this. Here we have the for keyword, we have this in keyword here, and also let's not forget at the end of a line we have the semicolon, so that is going to be required. Now, in order to tell Python that this code in the body here of the loop is part of this loop, you can see that we've created an indentation. So if we didn't indent this code, we would cause an error. The for loop is expecting to have a body of code. And to delimit that, to tell Python that this code here and any other code under it is inside of this for loop, we have to make an indentation. In some languages, for example, JavaScript, we have the curly braces, and that tells JavaScript that the following code or code inside of that curly braces maybe is associated to the for loop, for example. So here in Python, we use white space. We have an indentation, and that just allows any code, like I said, that has been indented to indicate the fact that that's part of this, in this case, this for loop. As and when we add any code which isn't indented, that's going to be the next line that's going to be executed after this for loop. Let's build a few simple examples so we can get a feel of the for loop before we potentially then apply it to our Django query set. So let's build an example. So we can ignore this code. I'm just inside of my Django project that we've been using. So let's create a new example again, example.py. Here we go. Right, so let's create a simple for loop. So we're probably going to need to loop over something. So let's build a simple structure here. We have a list with 5 numbers. Right, so let's loop through this. So we use the for keyword, and then we need to express some sort of variable name that we can utilize within the for loop body. So let's call this val. And then we use in. So for val in, and then x is going to then refer to the variable which is appointed to our data structure here, our list. So we need this, the colon at the end, apologies. And then underneath here, let's now make sure that we have the indentation. So if I add code here, for example, let's just try this. I'll just show you this. So let's print out, for example, val here. If I were to try and run this, you can see that, If we try to run this, python3 example.py, you can see that we have caused an indentation error. So we're actually told Python gives us some information to let us know that we've made an error, a syntax error here, and we just need to indent, or we need to create something that is indented. So if we indent that by using the tab key, so I've just indented that, then try this again. And you can see now what's happening is I'm looping through my list. Every time I loop through or iterate through, I'm printing out the value. So we need to be careful here, something that I may not have mentioned. Here I'm using a tab, but I can also use spaces. Now, if I were just to hover my mouse over and drag with my mouse down select and drag, you can see there's 2 dots there indicating 2 spaces. If I were to tab and highlight again, you can see that that is using, by default, that is using 4 spaces. Now, inside of Visual Studio Code, I may or may not mention this. Inside Visual Studio Code here, let's just bring this up so you can see. At the bottom here, it says spaces 4. So if I click on that, I can actually then select the indenting using spaces option, and then I can actually configure how many spaces I want to use when I press tab, for example. So that's a handy little feature there if you want to change your indentation spaces. Now, what's very interesting and what I haven't necessarily mentioned, and what you might be thinking is, how is a string an iterable? Well, let's take a look. So in actual fact, a string is an iterable. We can iterate over this string, which means that every single character here can be considered an individual character. So therefore, we can iterate over it. So let's just try that again. And what you're going to see is that we're going to iterate over the string here. And for each iteration, we're going to extract the individual characters and then print it out. So with this little bit of knowledge, let's now apply this to Django. As we remember, the Django query set returns a list. So potentially we can utilize a for loop to then present that data either to the terminal or back to the user on a template.